question is for both of you. Talk about the risk template and using a risk register.
Okay, so let me start.
Go ahead.
So not too long ago, I was teaching lawyers for a continuing legal education seminar, and the co-presenter, who's also a lawyer but from a different state, says, how many in here have used a risk register? So we're teaching contracting skills. Mm-hmm. Not a single solitary lawyer in the room raised their hand that they'd ever used it. Really? So this gentleman raises his hand and he says, oh, well, I use a rule of thumb. It's 3 times value. And he was on the supply side. And he's, okay, so now you know, banging my head against the wall. So I personally find less sophisticated organizations do not consistently use risk registers. So that's why I created the risk monitoring template, so that the contract professional can have a place to store the information, which then becomes the risk register for contract management. And I just have to have a shout out for my own tribe because I am a lawyer. It's, what are you thinking?
Yeah.
Not having a risk register to determine what the risk profile is.
Well, and it's funny because that varies with every single situation. I mean, you think about what's the worst thing that could happen with the supplier. And, typically limitation liability is some number of time of the, let's say you're spending $100,000 with them a year, maybe it's 3x that or 5x that or whatever, it's some percentage of what you're spending with them. But in many instances, the supplier could drive risk that's 1,000x, 10,000x, a million x, right? Yeah. Think about the Home Depot hack came from their HVAC supplier, right? That Sony hack came, you start looking at, especially when you're talking about cybersecurity, it's usually a subcontractor and it's usually tens of thousands, if not millions of times what you're paying the subcontractor. Yes. If that's the vector where the malware gets in or where the where the security breach is. And guess what? It tends to cost people in the C-suite their job. It tends to hurt the reputation of the business, sometimes irreparably, right? So there's a ton of thought that has to go into what risks am I really understanding that this supplier could be providing to me? And am I appropriately protected? And vice versa, right? I mean, the suppliers need to be protected as well. So a risk register to me is an absolutely critical analysis tool to make sure that we're protected to the extent it's reasonable to be protected.
So that's a great point, because had a contract professional been able to identify where the threat could have been, then you can start to determine, well, how frequently do I need to monitor that? So let me give you an example from manufacturing. So one of my clients back in the day was aerospace subcontractor in aerospace, so tier maybe 3, I think. So this is a typical risk scenario from my perspective, having done that level of work. So it was not, but I'll use the example. So Airbus says, I'm going to have you make these control sensors for our engines. It's awarded to the tier 3 because that's their specialty. So then the tier 3 goes out to the market and says, we need these subcomponents for the sensor. Okay, great. So ABC company gets awarded the work from my client, this tier 3.
Yep.
They then hop the Pacific Ocean and go get a really minute part for the sensor, which then gets built in, okay? The problem is that we assume that the contract flow downs are going to be honored. Well, on paper, Airbus's terms to the tier 3 are honored. The tier 3 flowed those down to ABC company. They were honored. And we still got a defective part from, Molly's whatever over in somewhere in Asia, right? Mm-hmm. So no matter how good you have a term written on paper, if you don't actually monitor the risk, then you can't avoid the risk. So the risk register, had one been done, would have alerted the fact that if a defective part came from somewhere in Asia, we need to up the quality assurance controls. So what had happened is tier 3 opens the box, takes one out, checks it, looks like it's good. So the parts per million. They had done what they had promised to Airbus. Airbus, though, goes and actually physically takes the thing apart for their quality assurance, and lo and behold, finds the defective subpart. Now, if we had understood how they were going to perceive risk and what the cost to the tier 3 was, we aren't just going to flow down, hey, you've got to pay attention to these terms. We would have mirrored our own QA to match Airbus's QA. We would have taken one of them apart, found out before we shipped to Airbus that there was a defective part. And I don't care how much money ABC owes me, I've got a defective part in a part that's about to go into an engine.
Right.
So we've got to be able to build that in.
Just for the record, engines are kind of important to air travel.
Engines are incredibly important.
Yeah.
But the thing of it is whoever's making this little wire doesn't get it if they don't understand how it's going to be used. If they don't get the importance of it, then they'll just use any old, because what it was a defective metal formula. They just did not use the formula that had been given to them.
Well, and that's, in that particular instance, it's a very highly regulated industry.
Yeah.
Right? There's the FAA, there's the European equivalent, there's all these other, and so in that industry, the chances are something like that's actually going to be found, which is good.
Yes.
Think about the other situations where it's not in other industries, right? And that's something that's really, really critical. If you don't have amazingly good visibility through your full supply chain, if you're doing blockchain, you're doing e-contracts, you've got a really good ERP system. You can track everything from provenance to every location it's been, who touched it and what they did. Great. If you can't, make sure you've accounted for that in those contracts.
Well, and it's not just in the contract, right? Because the language was there, but what we didn't do is assess the impact of the risk to match the quality assurance controls. So my point for the contract professional is, hey guys, you kind of have to let people know this is a problem. So I'm contracting with ABC on the procurement side, but they've given me the name of this other company that hops the Pacific Ocean as being a sub-supplier, which means I now have to change my risk register to say, we now have to do different quality assurance. I need to call Sally in quality assurance and say, we need to do a risk profile that's different because it's not just coming from ABC.
Report, saying yea verily thou shalt in the terms and conditions is different than when you say that and it's backed up by actions in the statement of work to demonstrate that you've done it, right? So that's what I meant by in the contract. I mean, the contract, not just the terms. But because you're going to want reporting, you're going to want inspection, results, you're going to want engineers talking to engineers in the governance process, so on and so forth, right? So the idea is that the risk register has to become real to feet on the street.
Yes, it has to become real to feet on the street. The reason I hesitated about the contract is that I think less sophisticated business people rely too much on the fact that there's the boilerplate language and we'll sort it all out, right? And the fact of the matter is by the time when I was in litigation, it got to me, right? That ship is so long past.
Contract's just a piece of paper, right? It's people that actually make things happen.
Right.
And so, great point. Just because it's in the contract doesn't mean anything's happening if you don't actually make it happen.
And the risk register is where people can actually make it happen.
And understand it.